Well, criticism is mounting over the Victorian government's plan to ban so-called conversion therapy on minors who identify other than heterosexual. Victorian Attorney-General Jill Hennessy said the government had consulted with hundreds of members of the public as well as advocacy and religious organisations to determine the best way to implement the new bans. But religious leaders and academics, well, they've got grave concerns over the proposal. One such man is Dr. Kevin Donnelly, who's a senior research fellow at the Australian Catholic University. He's well known to Sky viewers, and he joins me now from Melbourne. Kevin, you wrote an opinion piece today in the Herald Sun outlining some of your concerns. We often use this term gay conversion therapy, but it's a long way different today than perhaps what it might have been 30 or 40 years ago, and even whether things like counselling meet the so-called definition. You've got concerns, as I said, about this proposed law in Victoria. What are they?
Well, when you look at Victoria, what the Andrews government is doing, it's draconian. It's a fundamental attack on freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and it's compared to the other states, whether it's Queensland, for example, or Western Australia, it's very radical, very what I call cultural left. So when you read the legislation, as I did over the weekend, it talks about parents, even doctors, psychologists, and worst of all, I think religious leaders, priests or imams, not being able to advise or counsel or talk to teenagers or young children who are often anxious or concerned or pressured, if you like, to adopt transgenderism, but that will be an illegal offence if the legislation is passed.
So it picks up, and this goes to the definition of conversion therapy, it's sort of a mile wide and an inch deep. It picks up counselling services, any place where family and children, teachers and others want to get together and discuss issues of sexuality. Not as I said, the conversion practices we might have been told about that, were prominent a couple of decades ago, but we're talking about conversations about gender and sexuality. Would that meet the test under this proposed law as it's drafted?
Well, you're quite right to differentiate what may have happened, say, 20, 30 years ago, when there was a lot more pressure, probably unfair, unjustified. I'd be the first to admit that, in terms of pressuring young people not to transgender. But what we have in the legislation, and you only have to look at the history of Victoria under the Andrews government, whether it's euthanasia or whether it's late-term abortion, whether, I suppose more significantly, what's happened with the COVID crisis over the last 12 months. The government is very authoritarian, it's very dictatorial. The Premier is a control freak, everyone admits that. So when you look at the legislation, for example, James and Amelia, our children, they're obviously a lot older now. James, God bless him. What happens if you're a parent and you ask the priest home to talk to your child, you could be liable for conviction as the priest can. So that is the issue. You could drive a horse and cart through this legislation, and that's a great concern.
The Melbourne Archbishop, the Catholic Archbishop, Peter Comensoli, he was out today. He says religious leaders like him are concerned, and I'll quote him, that most mainstream Christian churches reject coercive practices or activities that do harm to LGBT people, but we're ready to work with government, he says, to find ways to ensure that people are protected. But this bill goes well and truly beyond that. Now, Jill Hennessy, the Attorney-General, says that they have consulted far and wide. I have a lot of emails of people that are concerned. They reject, as I say, the old conversion sort of practices, but they want to be able to have a consultation or a discussion with young people. They want to be able to, get the advice of a psychiatrist or a psychologist if a child's thinking about undergoing surgery or puberty blocking. Now, that I understand in the bill as drafted, that would be illegal for that sort of conversation to be had with a child, even with a professional like a psychiatrist.
You're right, and that's the power, if you like, of what I call the LGBTQI+, the gender movement. And the other contradiction here is if you look at Safe Schools, the gender fluidity program that has been national, Now it's only Victoria that's actually doing it. When you look at that Safe Schools program, it's quite obvious that the material, the resources, is pushing young children, primary and secondary, to question their own gender and sexuality. So it's a contradiction here. On one hand, the Andrews government is saying that a parent or a priest or even a teacher can't discuss the pros and cons of transgendering, but at the same time, they're actually funding a program going into schools which is promoting that kind of lifestyle, that transgender lifestyle. And I think that is wrong. Even worse, it says in the program, if teachers or schools think the child is mature enough, whatever that might mean, they need not tell the parent.
What concerns me here, the opposition was out today saying they're still working their way through the detail. This, I can't recall it being a big election issue. There's been plenty of other distractions through COVID. This bill seems to have landed just before Christmas and a real rush to get it through the Parliament. This is also where, you hasten slowly, in my view, as a legislator. This is where there needs to be, I think, the opportunity for interest groups on all sides of this issue, and parents in particular, and schools to have information sessions if needed, or conversations about this bill. And if there is merit in it, it proceeds sometime in the new year, but that's not the sense I get from the Andrews government.
It's not. It's rushed. And I'd argue there hasn't been enough consultation, especially with religious groups. The other point here is that when you look at what's happened in England, America, it's the same problem, that transgenderism, there's been this kind of push towards accepting it. So if a young person says, I want puberty blockers or I want radical surgery, I want to change my sexuality, what we're not looking into, and some psychologists in America and England, even Australia now, are warning against making too quick a decision, because we're starting to find that once these people who have transitioned, once they get to 25, 30, a bit older, there's often a lot of self-harm, there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty. And there are a number of cases where older people who've gone through childhood, gone through adolescence, they actually feel as though they've made a terrible mistake, and they would like, if they could, to reverse it. And often that's impossible.
And often the case, I've looked at a couple of cases in relation to the UK in particular, Kevin, and the Tavistock Centre. We spoke to an academic from the Tavistock Centre who had since resigned over this very issue. Quite a bit of the time, young people who think they are transgender actually end up being gay, and perhaps it's easier to go home to mum and dad and say that you are transgender or you have doubts about your gender in some families than it is to say that you are gay. Now, that is changing over time, I understand that, but this is also wrapped in the issue as well.
It is, and I taught for 18 years, and I'm a great believer that childhood should be about childhood. Now, there'll always be issues, especially given social networking, the impact of on young people in terms of social networking, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or, networking with other young people. There's a lot of peer group pressure there in terms of conforming to what can be seen as a radically new and different lifestyle or decision. And really what we should do is we'll say, stop, think about it, get good counselling, talk to your parents, talk to medical practitioners, talk to experts. But what we have here, and I'll go back to talking about religion, we have a bill which is actually saying it's illegal, it's a crime, you'll be convicted if you're a priest or an imam, whether it's Jewish religion, Hindu religion. If you're somebody actually talking about the pros and cons and you're suggesting it might not be a good idea, whatever reason, then you're in trouble.
Right, we'll watch this closely and we'll see how far it progresses before the end of the year. Kevin Donnelly, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.